Imagine walking into a police station to report that someone has been stalking you.
Right.
You're terrified. You detail the threats. You describe this person showing up uninvited inside your home. And as you're giving this description, you slowly realize the person you're describing is a sworn officer of the department taking your statement.
It's completely chilling.
It really is. Welcome to this custom-tailored deep dive designed specifically for you. Today we're opening up the official case files alongside Matthew McGough's really definitive investigative book, The Lazarus Files.
Yeah, it's an incredible resource.
Absolutely. And our mission today is to move beyond just the surface of what was a highly publicized 1986 cold case, the murder of a 29-year-old nurse named Sherri Rasmussen. We really want to explore the actual mechanics of institutional blindness.
Exactly. How a system that is literally designed to uncover the truth becomes completely incapable of seeing it when the perpetrator is operating from inside the building.
Right, because to understand how a killer evaded justice for 23 years, despite leaving physical evidence at the scene, we kind of have to deconstruct the architecture of the Los Angeles Police Department in 1986.
Yeah, you have to set the scene. So Los Angeles at that time was experiencing a massive surge in violent crime. It was, fueled by the crack epidemic and escalating gang violence.
Right, it's a totally different era.
Exactly. The LAPD was operating under immense pressure, but it was also this fiercely insular, basically paramilitary organization. The culture there prioritized departmental loyalty above almost everything.
Like an us versus them mentality.
Very much so. It was us versus the public. And they had this internal hierarchy where questioning another officer, let alone suspecting them of heinous crime, was just virtually unthinkable. The system was calibrated to protect its own structure first and solve crime second.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because against that backdrop of extreme institutional loyalty, we have two women whose lives collided in the worst possible way. Let's look at the victim first. Sherri Rasmussen was 29 years old, and she was the director of nursing at Glendale Adventist Medical Center.
Which is incredibly impressive.
I mean, reaching that level of administration in your 20s requires, an extraordinary level of organizational competence, intelligence, interpersonal skill. She was brilliant, and she had recently married a man named John Ruetten in November of 1985. But she had been carrying this very specific, escalating fear leading up to her death.
Yeah, she was being stalked by her husband's ex-girlfriend.
Right.
And even before the wedding, Sherri had documented several really disturbing incidents. She had explicitly warned her father, Nels Rasmussen, and some of her coworkers about this woman.
And it wasn't just like weird phone calls, right?
No, it wasn't just jealous phone calls. It was highly invasive. This woman had actually shown up at Sherri and John's condo uninvited, just, standing in their living room.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And she confronted Sherri at the hospital where she worked, threatening her directly. So the behavioral markers for violent escalation were, they were all clearly established.
And the woman exhibiting those behavioral markers was Stephanie Lazarus.
Right.
She and John Ruetten had met at UCLA. For John, it was kind of a casual relationship, friends with benefits.
Yeah.
But for Lazarus, it was this all-consuming obsession.
Completely.
But Lazarus was not just some civilian struggling with a bad breakup. She was a fully sworn, highly capable LAPD officer.
And that's the crucial detail.
It is. It's the part that really demands scrutiny. Like, if the LAPD puts its recruits through psychological evaluations and rigorous background checks, how does a modern police force fail to detect severe psychological red flags in someone they are literally handing a badge and a gun to?
Well, what's fascinating here is how effectively high professional competence can mask profound psychological instability, especially within a rigid institution.
Interesting. How so?
Well, paramilitary organizations like police departments, they largely measure psychological fitness through the lens of compliance. Resilience under operational stress.
Can you take orders? Can you handle a crisis? That sort of thing.
Exactly. And Stephanie Lazarus was smart. She passed the physical requirements, she followed the chain of command, and she closed cases. The psychological evaluations, they really screened for general psychopathology or an inability to handle the trauma of the street.
Right, they aren't looking for a stalker.
Exactly. They do not effectively measure compartmentalized interpersonal obsessions, provided those obsessions don't disrupt the daily workflow. And Lazarus was able to entirely separate her patrol duties from her personal fixation on John. To her superiors, she was a model officer.
It's like she functioned like a computer virus written into an operating system source code.
That's a great way to put it.
Right. The system's firewall never flagged her because it recognized her as a trusted native process.
Yeah.
Which, unfortunately, brings us to the morning of February 24th, 1986. Sherri had called in sick to work due to a minor back injury from an aerobics class. She was resting alone in her Van Nuys condo.
And investigators later determined that Lazarus likely knew John was at work and basically utilized that window of opportunity.
Yeah, and the details are just horrific. This was a sustained, brutal assault. The fight moved from room to room. Sherri was struck with a heavy vase. She was pistol whipped and eventually shot 3 times in the chest with a firearm muffled by a pillow.
It was incredibly violent.
But Sherri fought back fiercely, and during the struggle, she bit her attacker's arm deeply enough to draw blood.
And that right there, that bite mark, is the critical piece of forensic evidence that should have immediately directed the investigation away from the department's initial theory.
Which was so flawed to begin with.
Completely. When LAPD detectives arrived at the scene, they noted Sherri's missing silver BMW, which was found days later a couple of miles away, and they saw some stereo equipment stacked near her body. So based on those 2 visual cues alone, they officially classified the murder as a botched burglary. They theorized, a random thief broke in, was interrupted by Sherri, killed her, and fled in her vehicle.
But here's where it gets really interesting, because the physical mechanics of the crime scene completely contradicted that theory.
Oh, absolutely.
Let's look at the broken glass. There was a shattered sliding glass door, which the detectives claimed was the burglar's entry point. But the forensic reality of the glass dispersal proved the bullet traveled outward.
Right, shattering the glass from the inside.
Exactly, meaning the fragments fell outside onto the patio. Anyone actually breaking in from the outside would have pushed the glass inward onto the living room floor. That's just basic physics.
It's undeniable.
And beyond the physics, the statistical reality of the bite mark is just glaring. Burglaries are overwhelmingly committed by men looking for quick property acquisition. A vicious, close-quarters physical brawl resulting in a bite mark is highly indicative of an interpersonal, emotionally driven conflict.
Often between 2 women, statistically speaking.
Right, so why would experienced homicide detectives ignore basic physics and behavioral statistics just to cling to this burglary theory?
Well, this is a textbook mechanical demonstration of cognitive heuristics, specifically how confirmation bias operates under extreme cognitive load.
Okay, break that down for us.
So remember, in 1986, Los Angeles was experiencing over 1,000 homicides a year. Detectives were completely overwhelmed. And when the human brain processes complex, high-stress environments, it relies on heuristics, which are basically mental shortcuts.
So they see a TV and think robbery.
Exactly. The narrative of a violent home invasion was highly prevalent and easily accessible to these detectives. Once that heuristic was applied to the scene, confirmation bias acted as a filter. Evidence supporting the burglary theory, like the stacked stereos, was amplified.
Right, and the stuff that didn't fit
was minimized. Evidence contradicting it, like the outward shattering glass or that really anomalous bite mark, created cognitive dissonance. To resolve that dissonance, the detectives subconsciously downplayed it, because reevaluating the scene would have required dismantling their initial theory, admitting an error, and expanding the suspect pool in a direction they were institutionally conditioned to completely avoid.
Wow, and that structural blindness is exactly what Sherri's father, Nels Rasmussen, ran into when he tried to point them toward the truth.
Yeah, Nels was incredibly sharp.
He really was. He knew about the stalking, and literally within days, he was giving detectives Stephanie Lazarus' name. He detailed the uninvited entry, the hospital confrontation, all of it.
And their response was just shocking.
Unbelievable. The response from LAPD was to tell a grieving father that he, quote, watched too much television.
It's heartbreaking.
It's worse than polite disagreement. It was aggressively patronizing. Put yourself in his shoes. Imagine knowing exactly who hurt your loved one, but the people in power just patronize you and refuse to even look at the truth.
And the compounding institutional failure over the subsequent years is staggering. Nels wrote letters to the chief of police that just went completely unanswered. He even hired a private investigator.
Right. And didn't a true crime author look into it too?
Yeah, Ann Rule. She briefly looked into the case in the late 80s, and her LAPD contact actually warned her off, calling the file too hot to handle.
Wow. Too hot to handle.
Right. That specific phrasing suggests a latent awareness within the department that the case contained really dangerous implications.
And the most blatant obstruction happened in 1993. DNA technology was emerging as a viable forensic tool. Nels Rasmussen formally offered to pay out of his own pocket to have the bite mark swab tested.
And they refused.
The LAPD officially rejected the offer, citing that they, quote, didn't have a suspect to compare it to. We know they had Lazarus's name in the file from week 1.
Exactly. It was in the very first pages of the notes.
So when an institution acts this defensively, it really forces us to ask, are we looking at a deliberate, orchestrated conspiracy by detectives to protect a fellow cop? Or is this simply aggressive incompetence masquerading as protocol?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, systemic failures rarely require a smoke-filled room where people actively plot a cover-up.
Right, it's not like a movie.
No, it's usually a sociological function of in-group bias. Within a paramilitary structure, the detective is part of the in-group. The victim's father is the out-group. For the detectives to act on Nels's theory, they would have to concede investigative authority to a civilian, which totally violates their hierarchical worldview.
Right. They can't let the public tell them how to do their job.
Exactly. Furthermore, investigating an active officer introduces immense internal political risk. It is far easier and requires no active conspiracy to simply let the file collect dust. The inaction itself serves as the protective mechanism.
But the architecture of a cover-up, whether active or passive, cannot erase physical biology.
No, it cannot.
Which brings us to the technological shift that finally broke the case open. Let's talk about the mechanics of how evidence survives that kind of delay. The LAPD had taken a swab of the bite mark in 1986 and placed it in a freezer in the coroner's office. How does biological material remain viable for a quarter of a century?
It really comes down to cellular degradation and the evolution of forensic science. In 1986, DNA profiling required massive, pristine samples of biological material, which the bite swab just did not provide.
There wasn't enough saliva.
Right. However, if biological evidence is frozen continuously, the enzymes and bacteria that naturally break down DNA are halted. The cellular structure remains suspended.
Like a time capsule.
Precisely. And by 2001, the science had evolved to a process called shirt tandem repeat, or STR profiling. STR doesn't need a massive sample. It only needs microscopic degraded fragments of DNA to amplify and build a profile.
That's incredible.
It is. So in 2001, an LAPD detective named Cliff Shepard submitted that frozen swab for the newly available STR testing.
And the lab results fundamentally destroyed the LAPD's 1986 narrative. The DNA belonged to an unknown female.
Yep.
That single test proved the burglar theory was completely fabricated. But because Shepard was pulled away to work on an active serial killer investigation, the case went dormant again until 2009.
It's so frustrating how many times this stalled.
Right, but 2009 is when Detective Jim Nuttall of the Van Nuys Division finally pulled the file. Nuttall actually studied the crime scene photos. He looked at the perfectly stacked stereo equipment and recognized it for what it was, a staged scene.
Seemingly engineered by someone who knew what a burglary was supposed to look like based on a police manual.
Exactly, and Nuttall's recognition of the staging prompted him to re-interview Sherri's widower, John Ruetten. During that conversation, Nuttall asked if there were any ex-girlfriends with a grudge.
And John's response laid bare the entire 23-year failure of the LAPD.
Yeah, she told the detective that he had already given them the name Stephanie Lazarus decades ago.
And the reality of where Stephanie Lazarus was at that exact moment in 2009 is just chilling.
She was not in hiding.
No, she was a highly respected, veteran LAPD art theft detective working out of the exact same police headquarters, literally just down the hall from the cold case unit.
That is insane. It's like a dark magic trick, hiding in plain sight.
It really is. And the tactical problem facing Detective Nuttall's team at this juncture was incredibly complex. I mean, they had their primary suspect, but their suspect was trained in counter-surveillance, interrogation, and evidence handling.
Right, she knows all the tricks.
Every single one.
Right.
They needed a fresh DNA sample from Lazarus to compare against the 2001 profile from the bite mark. But they could not simply request a buccal swab or secure a warrant without alerting her.
Because if she realized she was under investigation.
She possessed the institutional knowledge and access to potentially destroy evidence, leverage internal relationships to stall the probe, or even flee the jurisdiction.
So they had to treat one of their own decorated detectives like a high-value cartel target.
Exactly. They initiated a covert sting operation.
And trailing a veteran cop who knows all the department's surveillance tactics requires incredible precision. They used a rotating team of undercover units, constantly switching vehicles so she wouldn't spot a tail in her rearview mirror.
Right, standard tailing procedures wouldn't work on her.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They followed her off duty until she stopped to run an errand at a Costco.
And the mechanics of the extraction required so much patience. They watched Lazarus purchase a drink, consume it in the parking lot, and dispose of the plastic cup and straw in a public trash receptacle.
But they couldn't just grab it right away, right?
No, the surveillance team could not move immediately. They had to maintain visual contact and wait until she had completely exited the area. They had to ensure she wasn't employing a common counter-surveillance tactic of circling back to check for tails.
Man, the tension must have been unbelievable.
Oh, for sure. Once the area was absolutely secure, they retrieved the discarded cup.
And they extracted the saliva from that Costco straw, ran it through the lab, and got the result. The DNA from the art theft detective was a microscopic, undeniable match to the DNA extracted from the bite mark on Sherri Rasmussen's arm.
The biological trap had finally snapped shut.
Yeah. But executing an arrest on an armed veteran officer inside the heavily fortified LAPD headquarters required basically a psychological chess match.
It did. The arrest took place on June 9, 2009. The detectives utilized a standard investigative pretext. They contacted Lazarus and asked her to come down to an interrogation room to consult on a case involving art theft.
Which plays perfectly to her ego and her expertise.
Exactly. And to disarm her without raising suspicion, they relied on standard operating procedure, which dictates that officers must secure their service weapons in lockboxes before entering the holding areas of the jail where the interview room was located.
So she willingly locks up her gun.
Right. Lazarus complied, completely unaware she was the actual target.
And when you watch the tape of this interrogation, it is a masterclass in psychological tension. Have you seen it?
I have. It's fascinating.
The detectives, Dan Jaramello and Greg Stearns, they sit her down. Initially, they discuss art theft, establishing this baseline of cooperative behavior. Then they execute the pivot. They casually mention they are doing a routine audit of old files and bring up John Ruetten.
And you can watch Lazarus's posture shift instantly.
Literally instantly. She's a trained interrogator. She knows the read technique. She knows how suspects minimize and deflect, and she immediately starts deploying those exact tactics.
Right, she feigns memory loss.
Yeah. She claims she barely remembers John. She suggests she doesn't know where the condo was.
She even attempts to maintain control of the narrative by asking them analytical questions about their investigation, trying to read their hand.
Like she's consulting on her own murder investigation.
Exactly. But her tactical knowledge was totally useless against the biological evidence. Once she realized they were not asking for her help, but were actively cornering her, she invoked her right to counsel and attempted to leave.
But she didn't get far.
No. She was arrested on the spot, handcuffed by her own colleagues, and walked out of the building.
And the trial in 2012 really dismantled her entire defense. The prosecution effectively demonstrated how she utilized her specialized police training, not just to commit the murder, but to stage the crime scene to manipulate the initial responding officers.
Which is such a massive betrayal of her badge.
Absolutely. A jury found her guilty of first-degree murder, and she was sentenced to 27 years to life. And for over a decade in prison, she maintained absolute innocence, claiming the DNA evidence was somehow compromised or planted. But the narrative shifted again very recently.
Yeah, in 2023, Lazarus sought release under California's youthful offender parole laws,
Right.
which basically allow for special parole consideration for inmates who committed their crimes at a younger age. Lazarus was 25 at the time of the murder. Facing the reality that denying the crime would almost certainly result in a parole denial, she finally provided a confession.
After all those years.
Yeah. She admitted that she confronted Sherri out of overwhelming jealousy, and when the confrontation escalated, she made the decision to take Sherri's life. She termed her own actions callous and heinous.
And the parole board initially recommended her release based on her record in prison and those youthful offender criteria.
Yeah.
Which, deeply traumatized the Rasmussen family all over again.
I can't even imagine.
But Governor Gavin Newsom intervened and exercised his authority to rescind the parole grant. He articulated that Lazarus did not simply commit a crime of youthful passion. She leveraged her authority as a police officer to actively evade justice for decades, allowing the victim's family to suffer without resolution while she built a career in the very institution tasked with solving the murder.
And this really raises an important question regarding the full scope of the LAPD's failure, because Matthew McGought's exhaustive research highlighted terrifying anomalies in the original investigation.
Like what? What did they miss?
Well, beyond the ignored bite mark, There were bloody fingerprints visible in the 1986 crime scene photographs that were never properly processed or entered into evidence logs.
You're kidding.
No. And there were official records indicating a specific detective visited the coroner's office to view Sherri's body, yet that same detective later provided statements categorically denying the visit ever took place.
Wow. The volume of uncollected evidence,
Yeah.
the immediate dismissal of a viable suspect, the hostility toward the victim's family, it forces us to look at the structural priorities of law enforcement.
Absolutely.
When an institution's primary directive shifts from the objective pursuit of truth to the preservation of its own reputation and the protection of its members, the machinery of justice fundamentally breaks down.
Right, and I think the profound takeaway is that Sherri Rasmussen, in her final moments, secured the very evidence needed to expose this structural failure.
Yeah, she solved her own murder.
She really did. By fighting her attacker, she collected the biological material that the institution tried to ignore. The evidence just sat quietly in a freezer, outlasting the careers of the detectives who dismissed it, waiting for the technology and a willing investigator to finally read it.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? When we zoom out from the specific forensic and legal mechanics of the Lazarus case, we are left with a sobering examination of institutional blind spots. The psychological mechanisms that protected Stephanie Lazarus are not unique to 1980s police departments.
No, not at all.
They exist in corporate boardrooms, in universities, and healthcare systems. Whenever a group's loyalty to its own members supersedes its commitment to external accountability, the environment becomes ripe for catastrophic ethical failures.
It's a universal danger.
It is. And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, focusing on the sheer psychological weight of this environment. Consider the reality of the detectives who worked alongside Stephanie Lazarus during those 23 years.
Just sharing the same office.
Right. You share a desk, you collaborate on complex investigations, you trust this person's judgment in high-stakes situations. All the while, the absolute darkest, most violent secret imaginable is sitting in a frozen test tube just down the corridor, meticulously categorized by the very system she works for.
It's terrifying to think about.
It forces you to wonder what happens to the internal psychology of an institution when it spends decades implicitly protecting a predator. Even after the truth is exposed, can the culture that allowed that predator to thrive ever be fully trusted to reform itself?
That's the question we have to keep asking.
It is. Thank you for joining us on this custom-tailored deep dive into the mechanics of the Lazarus files. Keep analyzing the systems around you, keep asking the difficult questions, and never accept the convenient narrative without looking at the evidence. We will see you next time.